cell body of the neuron are the dendrites. These brown things attached to them are representing the telodendria and synaptic knobs of the other neuron communicating with it. So if we take a look inside of the soma, we can see it has a nucleus and then rough endoplasmic reticulum. What do we call the rough endoplasmic reticulum of a neuron?
Nisal body.
Yeah, the Nisal bodies. And what color do they give the cell body?
Gray.
A gray color, good. Right here, where the soma meets the axon, we have the axon hillock, and then we can see the axon here. The other parts of this model shows the axon centrally located, and then this entire white cell around it has wrapped itself tightly over and over again like a band-aid. So imagine if we could just wrap and rewrap and rewrap the axon multiple times. That's what the cell is doing. In fact, it's wrapped itself so tightly that it's pushed its nucleus all the way to the outer edge. This cell that wraps itself tightly around the axon, myelinating it, is a Schwann cell or a neuralemocyte. If you notice, there's one neuralemocyte touching one axon. So I know this is a neuralemocyte, because if it was an oligodendrocyte, this one cell would be touching multiple axons. Okay? And then you can also see here, covering my cell is the endoneurium. It's like the endomysium of a muscle cell. Endoneurium of a neuron, though. And it's made up of areolar connective tissue. In the places where the neuralemocytes meet, we call this a neurofibril node. Some of you know this as a node of Ranvier. And you'll learn more about this in physiology. Yeah. Now let's take a look at our brain models. When we look at an adult brain, there are four major regions. We have the cerebrum, which is all of this wrinkled stuff that you see here. We have the brainstem here, the cerebellum, and then if we look at the inside, we have our last part, which is the diencephalon. I'll get to in a second. So there's my diencephalon right there in the middle. Focusing on the cerebrum first. The cerebrum is folded. The prominent folds of the cerebrum are known as a gyrus, while the invaginations are known as a sulcus. We have deeper sulci in various spots, creating fissures. This one here that separates us into a right and left hemisphere is known as the longitudinal fissure. Here, separating the temporal lobe from the frontal lobe is the lateral fissure or sulcus. And then separating the cerebrum from the cerebellum is the transverse fissure. There's also a parieto-occipital sulcus here, separating the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. The cerebrum is divided into 5 lobes. The most anterior one is the frontal lobe. It's separated from the parietal lobe by the central sulcus here. Within the frontal lobe, there is a single gyrus that extends all the way down, known as the precentral gyrus. In the parietal lobe, there's also a gyrus that extends all the way down, and that's known as the postcentral gyrus. Here we have the occipital lobe, the temporal lobe, and this model has pulled apart the lateral sulcus so you can see the insula or insular lobe right there. The gray matter of the cerebrum is located on the outside, and this houses every part of your neuron except the myelinated axons. And these neurons create the functional areas known as the cortical areas of the cerebrum. In the precentral gyrus, this cortical area here is responsible for motor information. So it controls skeletal muscle. We call it the primary motor cortex. This cortex here in the postcentral gyrus is known as the primary somatosensory cortex, and it's responsible for interpreting touch. On the left side of the brain, in the inferior part of the frontal lobe, we have Broca's area. Broca's area is responsible for controlling the muscles of speech. In the occipital lobe, on the posterior aspect of it right here, we have the primary visual cortex, which is responsible for vision. In the temporal lobe, number 15 here represents the primary olfactory cortex for smell. 16 is the primary auditory cortex for hearing. Your nose is in front of your ear. area, we have the primary gustatory cortex, which is responsible for taste. And then if we follow the lateral sulcus back, right here between the temporal and parietal lobes, this area is known as Wernicke's area. It is responsible for speech comprehension, understanding what you hear and what you read as far as language goes. And right in the middle of it's the Gnostic area, which incorporates things like your interpretation of sound and sight and smell into a picture that you understand. Yeah. So, continuing on with the cerebrum, the outside is the gray matter, the inside is made up of white matter. White matter is myelinated axons, and a bundle of axons in the CNS creates a tract. We have tracts that share information within the same hemisphere. That would be an association tract. We have some tracts that send information between hemispheres, so from here to here. That is a commissure. And then we have other tracts that send information from the cerebrum down through the brainstem, and that's a projection tract. Deep to the white matter, we have cerebral nuclei, which are deep gray matter parts of the brain. And our models, if you guys see, I gotta pull this out. Here's my white matter, right? Here's gray matter, the cerebral nuclei. This C-shaped cerebral nucleus here is known as the caudate nucleus. It's responsible for coordinating arm and leg movement when you walk. The amygdala, or amygdaloid body, this is where the anger sharks come from. And then putamen. Anybody remember what putamen loves?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, putamen loves spaghetti because it maintains posture for you and controls the erector spinae muscles. So those are your cerebral nuclei. Go ahead and say that. Alright, the next major part of the brain is the diencephalon, and it has two halves. You can see one half here, and then the other half is here on the opposite side. The diencephalon is made up of three parts. We have the hypothalamus here, which is connected to the infundibulum and then to the pituitary gland. And we'll talk more about that in the endocrine system. Here we have the thalamus, who's in charge of sorting information. This number 47 here is the interthalamic adhesion or intermediate mass. It connects one half of the thalamus to the other. And then this area here is the epithalamus. Specifically, the very end of this pink part here is known as the pineal gland, and it secretes melatonin to help you sleep. Taking a quick step back to our white matter of the cerebrum and our tracts, we have three commissures here. We have the corpus callosum, the anterior commissure, and the posterior commissure. These help the two halves of the cerebrum to communicate. Alright, moving down to the brainstem. The brainstem is divided into three parts. We have the mesencephalon, the pons, and then the medulla oblongata. In the mesencephalon, we have on the posterior aspect the tectal plates. It has a superior colliculus and an inferior colliculus. The superior is responsible for visual reflex, while the inferior is auditory reflex. On the anterior side, we have an enlargement, and this is the cerebral peduncle. This is where the motor tracts come down from, or come down through. Here we have the pons. The pons helps to control breathing through the medulla oblongata using the apneustic and pneumotaxic centers. And then lastly, the medulla oblongata that has the respiratory centers, the vasomotor centers for blood pressure, the cardiac centers for heart rate, and it's also responsible for like coughing and sneezing and gagging and things like that. On the anterior side of the pyramid, on the anterior side of the medulla oblongata, whoa, you guys can see, is the pyramid. The pyramid is an area for motor tracts to come down and crisscross. Those motor tracts are coming from the frontal lobe, from the primary motor cortex, down to the spinal cord, and they crisscross in the pyramid, which is why the right side of your brain controls the left side of your body, and the left side of your brain controls the right side of your body. On a side note, there's a funny little structure here called the olive that we just had you learn because it's fun. Olive. Okay, go ahead and say that. The last the last major brain region is the cerebellum. Here's half of it. These ridges on the outside are known as the folia. This ridge in the middle is the arbor vitae. The cerebellum is in charge of receiving sensory information coming in and incorporating motor information going out to help you balance and coordinate muscle movement. The end. All right. Cerebrum, longitudinal fissure, lateral sulcus or fissure, transverse fissure, and then it looks like there's a slight parieto-occipital sulcus there. On the pink brains, for some reason, it's only on the right side of the brain. You can see the pre and post central gyrus. Pre-central gyrus here, continuing all the way down. Post central gyrus right behind it, so the central sulcus is right in between them. We have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, the temporal lobe, and you cannot see the insula on this model. Here we'd have Broca's area, and where Nicky's area would be back here with Gnostic in the middle. In the pre-central gyrus, we'd have the primary motor cortex. In the post-central gyrus, we'd have the primary somatosensory cortex, primary olfactory cortex, primary auditory cortex, and then primary visual cortex. Here we have the diencephalon. We can also see the commissures. Here's the corpus callosum. Anterior commissure here, and that little dot right there is the posterior commissure. In the diencephalon, we have the hypothalamus, the thalamus, and then the epithalamus here, the pineal gland there in the epithalamus, and then there's the intermediate mass or interthalamic adhesion. The other thing this model has that the first one didn't, this right here represents the choroid plexus. This is where the blood and the ependymal cells make CSF. Here's the mesencephalon. We have the tectal plate here. The top bump represents the superior colliculus, and then the bottom one's the inferior colliculus. And then you guys see where number 13 is written? That's on the cerebral peduncle. Here we have the pons, the medulla oblongata, with the pyramid in front, and here our olive is pink instead of green. We have the arbor vitae inside of the cerebellum. Here we have the folia, and then this has a nice prominent vermis right there. The end. So, CSF is created by the choroid plexus, which is the blood vessels and the ependymal cells, and the ventricles of the brain. We had learned that the lateral ventricles are spaces within the cerebrum. So if I look, or if I have you guys focus here, you guys see the space right here? That is one of the lateral ventricles. This is the only model that you can see a lateral ventricle. On the other half, there's a wall there blocking the view of the other one. So if I knock down this wall, I would see an empty space and the other ventricle. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Now, so from the lateral ventricle, CSF will flow into the third ventricle. In class, we learned that the third ventricle is between the two halves of the thalamus. Here's one half. If I were to put my hands here, that third ventricle would be that space between the two thalami. Yeah? In our models, we label the third ventricle, this groove right here, around the thalamus in all of our brain models. From the third ventricle, we go down through the cerebral aqueduct to the fourth ventricle between the cerebellum and the pons. From here, we have two options. We can go down through the spinal cord in the central canal, or we're going to sneak out these little canals to the subarachnoid space. So this model here shows that. If I zoom in, you can see here's my hypothalamus and my thalamus. There's that groove for the third ventricle down the cerebral aqueduct to the fourth ventricle. And then you guys see this little arrow here? There is a tiny little canal down here that allows the CSF to sneak out, and it's going to fill this area underneath the pink. So let's take a minute and focus on that. We look here, this gray part is our first meningeal layer, and that's the dura mater. It's divided into a periosteal layer and a meningeal layer. Deep to that pink color is the arachnoid mater. And then below the arachnoid mater, we have the subarachnoid space, which is filled with CSF. So this purple space here represents the subarachnoid space filled with CSF. And then here, that red that follows every fold of the brain is the pia mater. In areas where the dura mater and the periosteal layer and meningeal layer of the dura mater separate, does this picture look familiar to you guys here that we drew in class, kind of? How we drew the layers and how we had a dural sinus in between the periosteal layer and meningeal layer? Yeah? Kind of? Anybody out there? Yes? Okay. So this is a dural sinus. And if you notice, the dura mater here is folding down into the longitudinal fissure. Anybody remember what wall this creates, what dural septum? The falx cerebri. So this is showing the falx cerebri with the superior sagittal sinus in it. Then we also have here in the transverse fissure, so here's the cerebellum, here's the cerebrum. Folded into the transverse fissure is the tentorium cerebelli. And then we have the straight sinus right in the middle of that. And then surrounding the infundibulum, keeping the pituitary gland in its place, is the diaphragma celli. You can zoom in. So let me show you one more model of that. Maybe help you understand a little bit more. So this model here is over $1,000. If you touch it, you need to let me know. So I know who to hold accountable if you break it. So what this shows here is the dura mater folding into the longitudinal fissure. You guys see that? And if I pull it out, I can see in it my superior sagittal sinus and my inferior sagittal sinus. So that's what it looks like when the meninges are in place.